Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Phillip Roberts. It's time to awaken America, y'all. Let's get into it.
I wanted to start this first episode with a little bit about my company and how I ended up doing this. For 2 decades, I was just like a lot of you, working long shifts, punching a clock, grinding it out on factory floors to provide for my family. But in 2023, after a life-changing injury, I had to rebuild. That's when I started Pharaoh Studios, turning my creativity into something bigger. Graphic novels, apparel, coffee, and wellness products. Little pieces of joy and purpose. Courage up, darkness down. Let's awaken America together. What's up, Patriots? You're tuned into the first episode of Courage in the Darkness, Awaken America. Tonight, I'm not here to sugarcoat anything or preach at you. I'm here to have a real conversation. One we're not supposed to have. Over the last few weeks, we've seen political violence rear its ugly head again, most recently with the Charlie Kirk shooting. And though many of us are rising up, there are many more people shrugging it off instead of uniting to condemn it. And even worse, there are people on social media celebrating. That should make every one of us sick, no matter your political affiliation. Tonight, we're going to ask the question nobody in the mainstream will touch. When did the left lose its way? How did a movement that once claimed tolerance and dialogue turn to name-calling, censorship, and even violence? And what does that say about where we're headed as a nation under God? So grab your coffee, pull up a chair, and let's shine a little light where too many would rather keep things dark. Because America doesn't wake up unless we do. Patriots, our nation is still broken from the senseless, tragic loss of Charlie Kirk. Regardless of politics, he was a husband, a father, and an American. My heart and prayers remain with Erica and their 2 children, his family, Turning Point USA, and the nation, as all of us face this devastating moment. Contrary to what the left would like you to believe, Charlie stood for free speech and honest debate. The idea that we can shape minds and hearts through dialogue, not destruction. When a life is taken because of somebody's ideas or ideals, the constitutional foundation that holds us together is under threat. Reports from those close to the alleged assassin, Tyler Robinson's own family, friends, and neighbors, confirm he identified with radical leftist views. That doesn't excuse or explain his violence, but it does paint a picture of an ideology that's becoming increasingly militant. And this isn't an isolated wound. We've watched political assassinations rock Minnesota with Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband murdered. We saw an arson attack on Governor Josh Shapiro's home while his family was inside. We all remember the Butler, Pennsylvania rally when a bullet grazed President Trump's ear and took the life of an innocent bystander that was protecting his family. These attacks against Republicans and Democrats are proof that something deep is broken in America. We can't afford to cheer when tragedy befalls an opponent. If anyone felt happy or celebrated at any of these tragedies, I want you to find a church and get right with the Lord, because you are the problem with this country. This isn't about party lines. This is about our humanity and the moral fabric of our nation. Now, before we dive into the chaos of recent years, let's take a step back, way back, to a time when the left actually liked Donald Trump. Remember when Trump was Hollywood's golden guest? He was popping up in movies like Home Alone 2, walking red carpets and cracking jokes on late-night TV. Rappers dropped his name in their songs as a symbol of success. He donated to Democrats, Republicans. You name it, he was invited to every big event. And nobody was calling him dangerous. Nobody was screaming fascist. He was just the guy that people called when they wanted a photo op or a headline. But tuck that memory away, because in just a moment, we're going to look at what happened the instant that he came down that escalator and he said those words that would change everything. I'm running for president. When Donald Trump announced his candidacy, it was like a switch was thrown. Overnight, the media in Hollywood that once praised him turned on him like a rabid dog. Suddenly, he wasn't a TV personality or a successful businessman anymore. He was public enemy number one. The 2016 campaign was unlike anything we'd ever seen. Before he'd even taken office, there were protests turning violent in some cities. What we saw wasn't debate, it was character assassination. People who voted for Donald Trump weren't just told they were wrong, they were labeled racist, Nazis, fascists. Words that carry deep, painful history, but were being thrown around like playground insults. And let's be honest, once you call somebody a Nazi or a fascist, you're not leaving room for a conversation. You're shutting the door and lighting the room on fire. That's not how a free society works. That's not how neighbors stay neighbors. Now, if everything that we've talked about so far hasn't convinced you how far off the rails this has gone, buckle up, Buttercup, because this next part cuts right to the heart of why our national conversation is broken. The left hasn't just disagreed with their opponents, they've decided to dehumanize them. Think about it. For generations, words like Nazi carried memories of millions murdered under Hitler's regime. Fascist recalled Mussolini's iron fist and the destruction of entire nations. These weren't casual words, they held the weight of history. But today, they're tossed around like cheap insults on Twitter. Authoritarians have always dehumanized their opponents to make them easier targets. Once you convince people their neighbor is a monster, anything becomes fair game. And that's exactly how you get riots in the street, lives lost, and families torn apart. Disagreement is not hate, debate is not violence, and your fellow American isn't your enemy just because they cast a different vote. When you spend years telling people that their neighbors are Nazis or fascists, monsters beyond redemption, you make violence feel justified. History gives us heartbreaking proof that what happens when hatred and fear take over. Let's look at some of the most powerful voices who were silenced because they dared to speak the truth. The silencing of voices by violence is a pattern that runs deep in human history. When leaders challenge corruption, hatred, or dangerous ideologies, those clinging to power or rage sometimes respond with violence. Our 16th president stepped into office with a nation already fracturing. His fight wasn't just to preserve the Union, it was a moral crusade for freedom. By 1865, as the war was ending, Lincoln called for healing, not revenge. And on April 14th, 1865, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Booth's radical hatred didn't save the Confederacy, it deepened the wounds of a country already bleeding. Lincoln's murder shows how ideology, when twisted into fanaticism, destroys the very things it claimed to defend. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't just a civil rights activist, he was a Baptist minister who rooted his mission in the gospel. His dream wasn't to divide America, but to call it to its own highest ideals. Despite the hatred and opposition from every side, King stayed committed to nonviolence. On April 4th, 1968, James Earl Ray, an escaped convict and segregationist sympathizer, assassinated King in Memphis. That bullet wasn't only aimed at King's body, it was aimed at the very idea that faith and nonviolence could transform a nation. Only a few years before Dr. King's assassination, America lost President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, the 35th president, was a young, charismatic leader who inspired Americans with a call to unity. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald openly embraced Marxist ideology, a man radicalized by extremist politics. His assassination wasn't about party, it was a wound to the country's soul, reminding us that when violence silences voices, it shakes the very foundations of our democracy. In 1965, America was shaken again. Different leader, different community, but the same tragic pattern. Malcolm X was one of the most electrifying figures of the civil rights era, initially calling for self-determination, but after his pilgrimage to Mecca, his perspective shifted. and he began to embrace the idea of human rights for all races. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated in New York City. His killing was about silencing a man whose evolving message threatened entrenched powers and rigid ideologies. When free speech and honest debate are replaced with violence, the entire nation loses. Long before America even existed, the ultimate pattern was set. Jesus' message, love your enemies, forgive those who hurt you, was revolutionary. Threatening religious authorities and challenging corrupt power, the Son of God was handed over, mocked, beaten, and crucified. An execution meant to silence him and intimidate his followers, yet his death didn't end his message. Christ's crucifixion stands as the ultimate example of how truth can't be killed, and love can't be buried. Our hope isn't in any party or politician. Our hope is in the one who overcame death itself. Now, before we get into January 6th, let's trace the modern history of how political violence from the left has been excused or even celebrated in our nation here. This didn't happen overnight. Most people today don't even remember this, but on November 7th, 1983, a far-left militant group called the May 19th Communist Organization planted a bomb right outside the Senate chamber of the U.S. Capitol. That blast ripped through the second floor. If the Senate had been in session, it could have been a massacre. The group believed violence was an acceptable political tool. These were American citizens radicalized by far-left ideology, yet the national conversation around this attack was surprisingly muted. It barely makes the history books. Key operative Susan Rosenberg even had her sentence commuted by Bill Clinton in 2001, a decision critics point to as an example of how left-wing violence is sometimes downplayed or even forgiven. The silence may have sent a message that some violence was negotiable if it came from the right political side. 16 years later, the Battle of Seattle erupted in November of 1999. What started as a protest against the World Trade Organization spiraled when small but coordinated groups of black-clad anarchists began smashing windows and vandalizing cars. The televised chaos was the first time many Americans saw large-scale street violence attached to left-leaning activism in post-Cold War era. In the aftermath, some activists tried to excuse or downplay the destruction, arguing that property damage was a legitimate form of political speech. Major left-leaning organizations failed to universally condemn the violence outright, and for many Americans, that silence looked a lot like condoning it. The images of broken windows became almost romanticized in some circles. The morning after Donald Trump won the presidency, Portland, Oregon erupted. Black-clad protesters, many associated with Antifa, started breaking windows, setting small fires, and confronting police. What's important here is how quickly the violence was excused or rationalized by some local leaders and media outlets. Some journalists framed the unrest as understandable anger against oppression or a necessary expression of frustration. This fed a growing perception when violence comes from left-leaning groups, it's somehow more acceptable, or at least less condemned, than if conservatives acted similarly. This wasn't spontaneous anger, it was calculated escalation. After George Floyd's tragic death, millions of people were rightly demanding justice and systematic change. But alongside peaceful protests, there were outbreaks of violence and destruction that cannot be ignored. In Minneapolis, fires were set, police stations were attacked, and looting took place. The chaos of these destructive acts were often underreported or worse, excused as necessary outrage. This selective narrative allowed some to argue that violence against law enforcement was legitimate, and that's not okay. Police officers are human beings, tasked with protecting communities, and using violence against them is not protest. It's criminal. The violence overshadowed the message for many Americans. Our final example brings us to Atlanta, Georgia, where protests against a police training facility highlighted the dangers of excusing political violence. A faction of activists began engaging in destructive and violent tactics. Construction equipment was vandalized and Molotov cocktails were reportedly thrown. Dozens of arrests were made, and some participants were charged with serious crimes, including domestic terrorism. Critics argue that the media and some political leaders often minimize the seriousness of these actions. In effect, the destructive actions were tactically excused, reinforcing the pattern ideology can excuse violence. Now we arrive at January 6th, 2021, a day that will forever be etched in American history. What happened at the Capitol was complex, and it's been portrayed in countless ways by the media. On that day, thousands of Americans gathered to express concerns about the 2020 election. Many were peaceful citizens exercising their First Amendment right. And yet, the story that dominated the headlines painted the entire crowd as violent extremists. Here's where context matters. Unlike many left-leaning protests we've discussed, some media and political narratives immediately framed every participant as a threat, despite evidence that a large portion were law-abiding demonstrators. Meanwhile, in prior years, leftist groups engaged in destructive protest, often without facing the same scrutiny or condemnation. That contrast matters because it highlights how political violence is selectively reported and excused. Too often, videos of January 6th are cropped, edited, or taken out of context to suggest that everyone there was engaged in violence. In reality, hundreds were peaceful, yet were swept into the same narrative. At the same time, attacks on police officers and property by anyone should never be justified. We can debate politics, but violence against law enforcement is unacceptable. The broader implications of January 6th are chilling. It exposed the double standards in how America treats political dissent, and it reflected a long history of selective outrage and excused violence. Conservatives watching this day unfold felt targeted, misrepresented, and in many cases betrayed by the way the narratives were spun. This day fits into a larger story of America's struggles with selective tolerance of violence, and if we ignore that, we risk repeating the mistakes of the past. As we wrap up today's episode, let's take a moment to step back and look at a bigger picture. From the 1983 Senate bombing to Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis, Atlanta, and finally January 6th, we've traced a pattern, one that shows how selective outrage or excused violence and ideological double standards have shaped our nation. This is more than politics. This is about truth, morality, and the very soul of America. It's about realizing that we can have differences, but we can't allow anger, destruction, or hate to replace dialogue and understanding. We need to stand firm in our beliefs, but do so with courage, compassion, and faith. We remember people like Charlie Kirk, whose life was tragically taken, and we honor his message that free speech, debate, and standing for truth matter. That's why we continue to speak out even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. That's why we encourage respectful dialogue between those who disagree. Differences don't make us enemies, they make us human. I'll be honest with you, I'll never back down from standing up for what I believe. I will always fight for truth, for justice, and for a nation that reflects Christian values of courage, compassion, faith, and integrity. And I hope that every one of you listening will do the same in your own way, standing firm for your beliefs while respecting others. If you found value in today's episode, I invite you to subscribe, share, and engage respectfully. Let's grow this conversation together. Check out my work at pharaohstudios.shop to see the other ways that we're spreading creativity, truth, and inspiration. Remember, awakening America isn't about shouting louder than anybody else. It's about living with courage, speaking the truth, and walking in faith. Stand up for what's right, stand up for your neighbors, never compromise your principles. Together, we can shine a light in the darkness. Thank you for joining me in this first episode of Courage in the Darkness Awaken America. I'm Phillip Roberts, and I can't wait to continue this journey with you. As we close, let this single wisdom guide our hearts. Do not envy the violent or choose any of their ways.